Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
So hi Steph.
Hi Sarah.
Today we have another guest and it's finally someone from your neck of the woods, and really your neck of the woods, like New Jersey.
Yeah, she's maybe about half an hour away from me. Not far at all. It is Bri Campos, Body Image with Bri. She talks about how she came to interpreting body image through the lens of grief, especially as she lives in a bigger body and has dealt with a lot of the common belief systems and experiences that accompany navigating this world in a larger body.
But just before we begin, if you want to connect with Bri, you can connect with her on Instagram. She's Body Image with Bri, that's BRI. And you can also check out her podcast, The Body Grievers Club. It is a really, in my opinion, one of the best podcasts I've heard on body image and making peace with your here and now body. So without further ado, here's Bri.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sarah. We have Brianna Campos. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep.
Okay. Otherwise known as Body Image with Bri on Instagram and on social medias. Here with us to talk about her concept of body grief, which I'm really excited to talk about because I think we touch on body grief and we mention it here and there, but it's really your focus. It's like, no, wait. We need to spend a lot of time here. This is the point. And I love this conceptually because it gives us permission to not find other ways of fixing it, managing it. It's like, no, let's just be with these emotions. There's no other place to kind of get to. So in that vein, how did you come to grief as a concept alongside of body image, and how did it become the front runner of the way you talk about body image?
Unfortunately, right, grief became a focal point for me because of lived experience. I've shared a couple of times with folks, and I've shared in my community that, oh gosh, in 2012, my older brother passed away. And grief for me was something I'd never experienced quite like that before. And I remember being so confused by it because I was like, I am sad, but I'm also angry and I also feel hopeless. And one day I could wake up and feel like, okay, everything's going to be normal again. And the next day I'm spiraling right back down. And I remember thinking, like, Googling, like, how do you get through grief? And first of all, the resources suck. But the book that helped me the most was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book called On Grief and Grieving. And it was the first book that I was able to read and feel seen, that she was able to capture every part of what my experience has been. The struggle of not wanting to feel grief, the anger of experiencing and feeling the grief, anger at the world and those in my family for not being able to meet me where I need them to be, and just normalizing it. And there was something so powerful about that, that as I started my deep dive into food freedom and what I now call body acceptance, I realized that the reason I couldn't get to acceptance, similarly to grief, was because it was a stage at which I was trying to arrive at, rather than allowing the process of grief to exist and to flow, and that it would be a byproduct, that the acceptance isn't like, woohoo, my brother's dead, right? It was after allowing myself to feel the scariest feelings, that even though I was afraid I'm not going to make it through this, that eventually I was able to become more familiar with the wound. And make no mistake, like, it sucks. I would unlearn every message, every story. I would not have a business if it meant that I could have my brother back. And this is why in the beginning I was talking about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's. She has they added a stage to grief called Finding Meaning. And there might be a book on that too. But David Kessler, who works very closely with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, added the stage Finding Meaning to grief. And that is what I believe my business, what Body Image with Bri has become. I have found meaning and purpose in the loss of my brother, because not only have I learned how to grieve, but now I can apply it to other areas. I think oftentimes we think grief is reserved for death. And actually, the stages of grief used to be the stages of death and dying. And they changed it to grief. But grief is different than bereavement. So losing someone is bereavement. But we lose things and experiences and experience loss on a daily basis. And there can be grief there.
It also reminds me of how I might look at aging too, and the process of grief with aging.
So if you look up the definition of grief, it's defined as deep sorrow. And when you look up the definition of sorrow, it's defined as loss that causes distress. So for me, the loss of control over my body size caused me distress. And what I do in my work is I teach people, okay, why? What is the story that the loss of control of your body means? For a lot of my clients, it means a loss of privilege, a loss of being able to fit into society, a loss of people's opinions of them. I would say the three biggest hurdles I experience are: one, what will people think of me? We are terrified of how the world is going to judge us. Two, but I'm uncomfortable. And so there is this loss of what seems like body comfort. And then the third hurdle is, but what about my health? So that was for me the first hurdle I had to explore was, can I exist in a large body and be healthy? When I realized I could, but it wasn't enough, right? Like, okay, well, even if I could be healthy, I don't want to be fat. I had to explore why. And then it was, I'm afraid what other people are going to think of me, or I'm not comfortable in my body. And having to explore those hurdles separately from what I've pretended it was supposed to be about all along.
When you were talking about making meaning, first of all, I want to thank you just for using your experience with this massive loss in your life of your brother. It feels like that was the meaning that was made out of the grief you went through. Is that's all connected to the work that you do now? And you wouldn't be able to do the work you did now had you not lost your brother.
Absolutely. I don't know any time in my life where they teach us about grief. I remember in the depths of my grief, and I talked about it with my therapist at the time, and I was like, this is like no other feeling I've ever felt. And she said, right, because you've never experienced anything like this before. And I remember thinking, like, okay, well, it's like I understand anger, I understand sadness and the hopelessness. I've just never experienced it all at once. And then when I'll give you an example too of what I realized within the first year was that the more I stopped myself from crying, like, nope, we're not going to be sad. We're not going to let it happen. Then it would persist, right? And then it would feel like this long, unending wave of sadness. But rather than fight it, I said, if I just go with it, what is the worst that's going to happen? The worst that was going to happen is I was just going to keep crying and I was never going to stop. And what I found is like, actually, no, that when the feelings come up, if I can honor them rather than control them, the emotional release happens. And then you come back to shore, right? And so it's like a tide. You can fight the tide, but what's going to happen? You're going to be lethargic trying to fight it. You can ride it out. It's going to put you back on shore. And so when I started my body image grief excavation, I don't like calling it a journey. I call it an archaeological dig. I realized I was just looking to get to that point of like, I just want to be able to be on solid ground where I can be like, but I was trying to control that. I was trying to produce that outcome rather than, okay, if I explore the edges of this despair, am I going to then naturally find that acceptance, that shore? And the answer is yes. What sucks is that it's a continual process because then you land on shore and then there's another grief or grievance that comes up. It's a continual process. And this is the other thing is I feel like, right? So back to the archaeological dig, I felt a little lied to by people who had made peace with their body, like that it was this place that you could arrive to and it was just this beautiful land of body acceptance and bikini wearing, like don't care what anyone else thinks. And that is not reality. I think that for me, body acceptance is I know that life is going to throw me curveballs. I know that the tide is going to come, but when it comes, I have the resources to maneuver through it till I get back to shore.
Yeah. I loved that. This is why I think it's so important what you do as far as making grief this centerpiece, because I think even when it comes to body image, like when we are in bereavement, it's almost like we have this permission to grieve. It's expected that we do. It's a reason. But after a certain amount of time goes by, it's almost like we feel like I should be over it by now. And same with the body image. It feels like, is body image really a reason to be grieving? We don't really give ourselves enough, we don't give it the space to say like, yes, absolutely, there's loss here and there's reason to grieve within body image. Because I think sometimes we think of body image as a vanity issue rather
Mm.
than something that has more layers than that. And
Yeah.
that doesn't involve loss. And I think presenting it as a tool rather than a here, do this and then get here. And that's how you get through this. It's like, no, you keep using these tools. They're part of your toolbox.
Well, it makes me so angry when people say like, "Oh, body image is a vanity issue." How are we, especially as women in society, supposed to grow up in a culture that tells us what bodies are acceptable and not grow up with a vanity issue? Like, I'm not really sure how that works, and it's deeper than that, right? So it's like on the surface, yeah, people think it's just about how you look, but in reality, it's so much more than that. It is your self-esteem. It is your internalized fat phobia. It is how you interpret the world and how people will approach you. A lot of times, one of the things that we do in especially in my body groovers course is I have folks sit and think about some of the unwritten rules that they grew up knowing that were never explicitly said. And so, I mean, how many fashion rules, how many body rules were we told that we just took on as our own? I'll give you an example. How many of us, when when we were going clothes shopping for the next season, which again, I just want to highlight as privilege that not everybody gets to do that. But those of us that did go back to school shopping and we were a different size than we were the year before, and that panic set in at that young age. Why do we think it's going to be any different now as adults when we put our clothes on and they don't fit? When our entire life being a different size or growing was something bad. So that wound, if you remember that feeling back from when you were 5 years old, 10 years old, that wound is going to carry us through and is going to be ever present today unless we unpack the story, unless we can unlearn that rule. And I have a framework for grief. And it's not sexy. It's not fun. I mean, I think a lot of people think the body image work is like the sexy stuff. Like, I'm going to go on the date and I'm going to wear the bikini and I'm going to do a boudoir shot. And listen, you can do those things. But what I'm going to tell you is that you might prepare to do those things and be like, wow, I am super underprepared to have done this exposure, and I don't think I can do it. And then you'll feel like a failure because you didn't do it. And I know this from experience. And so my framework for grief is one, we need to build awareness. We need to know what rules, what stories are being told, what beliefs that we're still holding on to. Then we need to actively unlearn those. It's not enough just to know I talk like crap to myself, but like whatever, like I know I shouldn't. No, we have to actually change the dialogue. There has to be this active shift, even if it doesn't feel innate, even if it doesn't feel smooth, there has to be a shift in choosing something different, knowing we might not feel any better doing that. The third of the framework is over time. One of the biggest myths that I hear is like, time heals old wounds. No, that's crap. Time heals nothing. The only thing time does is it allows the wound to become familiar. And so over time, if you're experiencing the same wound and now you have these awareness and the tools to be able to work through it, we have a better opportunity to begin to implement those tools when the suck is happening. But that takes time. And unlike with diets and diet culture, we don't have a way of measuring it anymore. We don't get the scale anymore. We don't get the quote unquote non-scale victories. The only thing we have are these like litmus tests over time of, oh, wow, a year ago, putting on clothes would have devastated me. Now it's uncomfortable, but it's not devastating. And then the fourth, and what I find to be the most helpful, is in community. That when we are doing this work by ourselves, we can gaslight ourselves into going back to old patterns. And that can happen whether then we go to a family dinner and somebody tries to argue us that our way of life is really unhealthy, or we go to the doctor and we experience shame. That when we are in community, when we are with other people who are experiencing the same struggle as us, there is an ability for us to have compassion for them, unlike the ones we can hold for ourselves. And so that we can see that reflected in other people. And I can think, I know how I would advocate for my friends and how I would advocate for my clients. How do I begin to advocate for myself in that way?
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
For a few years, I volunteered at a bereavement charity and I used to do bereavement counselling. So I've very much seen that resistance to grief. And when I lost my own mother, I probably held my grief back for about 7 months before I even went anywhere near it. I was in my own little world and just wasn't really feeling much at all. And there was always someone in the charity, there was this guy who came along 27 years after his wife had died to finally come and work through his grief. So my question is, just thinking about the people that might be listening to this, when we think of grief as this process with no end, there might be people thinking, well, why would I do it? Why would I go into the pain when I don't know that if or whether it's even possible to come out the other side of it? How do you speak to that, Bri? Because I'm sure you come across this kind of thing all the time.
I believe that there's no other way. The grief is unavoidable. We can't bypass it. And that fear, right, of exploring the outer edges, because if I begin, I'm never going to find that solid ground, is a lie. It's just unfamiliar. And if what you're doing hasn't worked for you, then this is where we need to try something different. I, dieting for my entire life, I couldn't imagine not desiring a smaller body. And guess what? I still desire a smaller body in just a much different way than I did 5 years ago. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, my need for a smaller body was because I wanted to secure the love from other people. Today, I love myself. That if other people don't love me because of my body, I can handle that. Being smaller would make my life easier. It would make my life more accessible. And that speaks to the culture, that speaks to the fat phobia that exists in our culture. And I can then direct my anger rather than inward at myself or at my family for the fat phobia that I grew up with, to get angry with the culture, to get angry with the norm, and to want to do something radically different. Think about our generation, and this generation has Lizzo, like seeing these kids who love Lizzo, and they have an icon, they have somebody who exists in a larger body who is living their life. We are better off than we were 30 years ago, and we still got a heck of a lot more work to do. But with grief, it is deeply personal, and you cannot rush the process. You cannot bring somebody and say, you have to do this. But if I was, working with somebody, and I am a trained mental health counselor, and so if somebody were to come to me and said, it's been 27 years and I haven't grieved my partner, one, I would sit in the suck with them and just acknowledge that I get it. I mean, and I don't get it, but I understand why that feels impossible. And I imagine that it's been a really hard 27 years.
I also want to touch on just the idea that there might be people listening to this thinking that grief means sadness and like the anger part of it as well. And bargaining, denial, I want to say all the different stages. It might be worth just, I don't know, touching on by what we mean by grief in case anybody's not sure.
I just shared this in my stories this morning. The way I describe grief is, do you remember when we were kids and we would like, I'm going to touch the bottom of the pool? And so you jump in, you touch the bottom, and then you're like, oh, I'm running out of air. I gotta go up. And you're swimming to the top and you're like, oh, thank goodness, I'm almost getting to the surface. And then just as you think you're at the surface and you realize, nope, you're not at the surface. And that, oh my God, I'm not at the surface. And then panic sets in and you're afraid, like, this is it. I'm going to die because I had to be a show off and touch the bottom of the pool. That moment from when you think I'm going to die to when you reach the surface and you can take a breath, that feeling is how I describe grief. I describe grief a lot like carbon monoxide. You can't see it, you can't feel it, but if you don't address it, it will steal all of the oxygen in the room. The stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, then acceptance. And then David Kessler added finding meaning and purpose. And not everybody will find meaning and purpose in their grief. A lot of people, they think of the stages, but they don't think of how that looks. And in my work, I think that, from a body image perspective, most people are orbiting between bargaining and the depression. Their pants don't fit and they start to feel that sadness. And so instead of acknowledging that sadness, they go right back to, you know what? Maybe it's because I had something salty. Maybe it's just because of the holiday weight. Maybe I just need to, get back on track. And then they go through the rest of the stages of grief until the next thing that activates that depression. And what I prepare clients to do is, do we have the tools to explore the depression of body image? Again, that definition of grief is the distress. I describe body grief as the perceived loss that comes with the intentional, like when we stop trying to change our bodies and our bodies continue to change. The body grief is the perceived loss that accompanies body changing. This can come up, body grief can come up with pregnancy, right? When your body is changing or your body is changed after pregnancy, this can come up with aging. This can come up with illness when you experience a diagnosis that you're not prepared for and there is loss accompanied. What we don't normalize is the loss that comes with existing in a fat body. What does that mean? What is the cost of living in a fat body in our society? And make no mistake, the cost is high, but the cost is higher on yourself when you continually try to change your body size. That to me is another bargaining, right? Is like, I'm just gonna do this diet. This is just going to make me feel better. And the problem is, for how long? How long will we sustain that better feeling? The reality is, no one can know. No one can actually know for sure how long a diet's gonna last. What we know from the research is it's not long enough. And so for me, the benefit of accepting this body is far greater than what it costs me in society.
That's really powerful. It brings to mind how helpful it is just to name this, even where you're thinking, like you described, you're putting on your clothes and they're too tight, and your brain automatically wants to bring you to the place of bargaining. It's a stage of this for a reason. Like there's something about fixing it and getting away from the feelings that is very compelling. And even to think, oh, that like I'm in this bargaining space. Like that's what I'm doing here. Helps you step away from being in it and identifying with it. But to name it, this is I'm in bargaining right now, is like it's a bit humbling, but it's also kind of like, okay, that's something my brain is doing. It's not something I need to do. I don't need to go chasing the thing. My brain's just trying to cope. What comes after this piece? Like if the bargaining is moved through, what's next? And I think those are the harder. These are like the depression piece. And what are the tools? Even how does it look for you moving through it today? How do the stages show up? And how do you move through them personally?
Yeah, great question. Just like any other discomfort, um, the first skill that I make sure all of my clients have is are coping skills. Do you know how to cope with distress? Do you have the ability to cope with distress? The reality is we all have the ability, but we haven't always used that skill or that tool. And so I'll give you an example of what that might look like. So I might say today, when this is being recorded, on a scale of 1 to 10, the idea of putting on clothes and them not fitting is only distressful, maybe at like a 2. I'll use that scale of like, okay, this is not impossible. But if you were to ask me to do a boudoir shot, that might be a little bit more activating. That's probably like maybe like a 7. And so what does that tell me? It tells me there is something about doing the boudoir shot that I need to explore that is activating me. That doesn't mean I'm going to go out and do one. I can and probably will at some point, but there is something about that that is communicating a story with me. I teach my clients how to unpack that story. What is the story communicating to you? Uh, there's research that supports that our feelings typically last for like 90 seconds unless there's a story attached to it. And so that's why for me, not fitting into clothes has less of a story because I originally was, well, I feel bad about spending money when I've just spent all this money on clothes and now these clothes don't fit. So if I were to have explored that with a client, I would have said, oh, it comes down to finances, right? And just being financially intelligent. And I would ask myself, would I feel the same way if I had lost weight? If I had lost weight, would I have felt bad about needing clothes that fit my smaller body? And when I realized no, then I realized the financial literacy, the financial excuse was just that. It was just a guise of, I don't want to have to spend money because it feels shameful. And that's where the story was, is getting smaller was a good thing. Getting bigger was a bad thing. And then that's where the work needs to be done. And so another skill that I'll use with clients is reframing. If you follow me, you know, I am not big on affirmations because I feel like it's like one of the only things that we have for body image of like, um, oh, you hate the way that you look in the mirror. Say 3 things that you like about yourself. I'm not doing that. No, my time and your time is better than that. What I do is I will highlight a belief that I want to unlearn. And I write them down. I have them all over my desk. So I actually have one here right now. Um, and the one on my desk says, I'm trying to solve a problem that doesn't need to be fixed. What I'm going to tell listeners is that when it stops being about your body image, then it becomes about your interpersonal relationships. It becomes about your business. Then it becomes about, you know, it just finds a new place to nest. And so I'm trying to solve a problem that doesn't need to be fixed. I used to do that with my body. I was trying to prevent illnesses that could potentially be correlated with being fat when I realized I don't have to solve that problem. Like that, like we'll cross that bridge when I get there. I can live my life the way I want to now. Um, you know, if health is a value to me, being mindful of that, exploring beyond that. But if I were to contract an illness, it wouldn't be my fault. But now showing up in my business, now I'm like, oh, I'm trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist yet. And so my reframing is by coming up with a new belief that I want to believe. So when I started on Instagram, one of the biggest concerns I had was that I was going to get trolls. And very quickly I realized, oh, actually, I don't care about the trolls. Like the trolls, they don't mean anything to me. But what scared me more was disappointing people I liked. And I had this deep fear of like, people aren't going to like you. Like this is gonna happen. People are gonna not like you. So the reframe I came up with, and I keep it over here on my corkboard on the side, is you are not for everyone and you are deeply loved. And so every time that fear came up of like, you're gonna get this wrong, you're gonna upset people, people are not gonna like you, you're gonna be misunderstood, I'd add my reframe in. But my reframe was impactful, that it actually felt true. I haven't come up yet with a reframe of I'm trying to solve a problem I don't need to fix yet. But that's part of my process of I take the thought, I write it out, and as I am noticing that's that building awareness, as I start being aware of that problem, I think about, well, how might I help a client? How might I help a friend? What might I say to challenge that thought? And when I find one that I'm like, ooh, that resonates, it goes on my affirmation board or my impactful reframe board. And I keep them up because that's a litmus test for me. I can say, wow, I remember when I used to feel this way and I don't anymore.
But Bri, I already hear the reframe in that because the original thought was, I have to fix this problem. But the reframe is, I'm trying to fix a problem that I don't need to fix.
Yeah.
I think you've got it already. You've got it.
You did it. And that's the thing is it doesn't feel quote unquote like that. And I think that's the trap that people fall into with body image is like, okay, but I don't feel accepting of my body. And I was like, well, you not intentionally changing your body is an act of acceptance, even if you don't like it.
Yeah.
When you've talked about body peace, you've talked about the distinction between distress and discomfort. And I really liked this because you were saying that body peace is about reducing or alleviating the distress, but it isn't going to get rid of the discomfort. And I wonder if that's why people feel like they haven't got there because they think they're going to feel comfortable in this body. Having bodies full stop isn't a comfortable thing. Add on all the other things on top of body size and culture and pressures and expectations and judgments. And yeah, I just loved that.
Me, yeah. I mean, I think it's like thinking that there's a timeline, right, for grief of that, like, oh, you're gonna not one day be sad about, the losses that we've experienced in life. Who's to say that that's gonna be the outcome? What I do think is possible is that the sadness won't be overbearing anymore, or we will be able to manage the sadness, or we'll be able to move through it much quicker. And for me, the discomfort is physical, distress is emotional. And if we can manage the emotional distress around the discomfort, yeah, if you want to not have discomfort, then you can't have a body. Like like there's no way that it exists. And I'll say that to clients too of like, do people in smaller bodies not experience discomfort? And they'll say things like, not as much. And I'm like, it is easier to exist in a smaller body in our society. But I know people who are in smaller bodies who have the same, I mean, who can measure pain, but have body discomfort, have achy joints, have sciatic issues. They have all these same issues. It is part of having a body.
You talked earlier about 3 stages in a framework, one of which was the health, piece where
Yeah.
that came up, and you said once you moved through that, then it was the first 2 that you were looking at. But what if somebody who says, like, "I want to explore this and learn to feel more acceptance, but I'm not convinced of these things." Like, how do you begin the journey of just changing a belief system that is tied to health and weight?
So can you maybe give me a specific example and I'll tell you how I might work through that.
So, I have clients who say, like, "But I can't be healthy in a larger body." Like, like, it is one and the same, and so it's almost easier when you've been in the Instagram world and in this sort of genre. It's like you've seen the posts, you know this stuff. We've been reading it every day. But for someone who's new to this conversation, where do you begin to start looking at the beliefs around health and weight? I mean, when that is such an ingrained, it's a default setting, and I mean, it's just completely normalized that, like, yes, if you have more body weight, you're less healthy. I mean, that's just how it is. It's how doctors will teach us this, right? So it's like, well, are you telling me the doctors are wrong? Like, how do you deal with a client who's coming from that ground level?
Sure. And from a coaching perspective, I usually will do motivational interviewing in that I really need to understand where the belief is coming from of like, it's just known information that we need to exist in a smaller body to be healthy. So then my question would be, are p- so being smaller is what makes people healthy. Smaller bodied people don't experience health concerns. And that's not true, right? People in smaller bodies experience health concerns just the same. So if that is inaccurate, how else can we describe health? What does health look like? If you had asked me this 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I might have said health is how my blood work comes back, how much I'm able to move, how or my eating vegetables. If you were to ask me now, my health would be, how is my mental health? How am I taking care of myself? How is my work life balance? Am I able to take care of myself emotionally? We celebrate and demonize parts of health, but I have found that my mental health impacts my physical health way more. And for reference, right, I had shared this on my Instagram. I am the least mobile I have ever been in my entire life. COVID slash making peace with my relationship with movement. Um, I am not active like I once was, and I have some mobility issues. And I don't eat vegetables every day. Needing that permission to not eat vegetables every day. And my blood work came back perfect. What has changed is I no longer work an agency job. And so I have a lot more autonomy over my schedule. I'm sleeping a lot more than I once was. And I've been able to go to the doctors consistently for 3 years because my doctor will never comment on my weight. Those things have impacted my health way more than how much I've eaten or how much I've moved my body.
Mm.
And so at the end of the day, it would really be to uncover if the only definition I have for health is how small my body is or how mobile I am or how many vegetables I'm eating, we have to consider that that is one of the many determinants of health. And there are many determinants for health, and that it is false to say that we have control over that. And our evidence of that is that, again, people who are supposedly the quote unquote healthiest, they eat vegetables, they run, they do this, they get sick, they die. That if death is the outcome for everyone, there's no escaping this life without death or illness. How do you want to live? Do you want to live in constant fear of judgment of your health? Or do you want to live your life and manage the things that we can with your health?
This is where your in community piece is so poignant because when, even just in the conversation, like I think when we enter the world, there's such a, again, that default setting of like what we're taught and what we believe. And then when you enter into conversations or communities where this is talked about like this is the normalized way of talking about health, it's so empowering. And then you're like, oh yeah, like, right, this is my value system and we need reinforcement of this because we're not getting it anywhere else.
Exactly.
So there's something so true about surrounding oneself with these conversations. I think as therapists and coaches, it's part of the job, right? It's built into our days. But if your career isn't rooted in this, the community piece is so important, just to have other people moving through this similar things and learning alongside of other people and experiencing these value systems with others. Because even as you mentioned with your doctor, so many people, are like, I don't have a doctor who doesn't make me feel badly about my weight. And where that's coming at you, it's so important to have a recourse of supportive community, people who are having these conversations to be able to balance what's going on and what's coming in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if people want to be a part of your community, Brianna, is it open? People can join at any time? Do you open it up at certain times? How do people get in?
Yeah, so I have a community called the Body Groovers Club. Right now, the access to the club is just through drop-in opportunities. So for this month, my drop-in is my new masterclass, Body Acceptance. And it's a little bit pricier than my other master classes. Um, so basically, I've taken all of the tenets of my Body Groovers group course and I tried to make like a Spark Notes version so that if the course isn't available or accessible to you, that you can still get this information and DIY it a little bit. So the way to access the club is currently through drop-ins. Otherwise, those that have taken the course, they get continual access to it quarterly. So what I encourage people to do is just come to my Instagram and check it out and see how you can become a part of our community. And what I also encourage people to do is like, see if there's ways to get connected in your own community. See if there's ways that there are people who are I'm sure there are people who are like-minded, who will believe the same things as you, who are trying not to diet. And we can make our own community. But if you need some help, um, and want a virtual community, then definitely come join mine.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Bri, for your time and for sharing all your wisdom. I mean, I really don't sound patronizing, but I think you're like 30, aren't you? 30, 31?
Yeah.
That's so much wisdom and I just feel like you've got so much time to carry on doing everything you're doing. I think it's much needed in this area. So I appreciate you.
Thanks.
Before this, I thought I'll listen to a couple of your podcast episodes just to kind of get the gist. And I ended up listening to like 15 or something like that. I thought it was really, really fantastic. I said, wow, she is so wise.
So much. That is such a high compliment.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.